If you're going to push Shohei Ohtani that hard, he won't play. Dave Roberts didn't raise his voice when he said this. He didn't need to. The words carried enough weight on their own. Because this wasn't frustration speaking. This wasn't a manager venting after a tough loss. This was a deliberate, calculated statement from a man who had just sat across the table from his best player, looked at medical test results that hadn't been shown to anyone outside the organization, and made a decision that he knew would shake the entire baseball world. The All-Star Game was 2 weeks away. The rosters had been announced. The promotional materials were already printed. And Shohei Ohtani's face was on all of them. But none of that mattered anymore. Because what happened behind closed doors at Dodger Stadium on that Tuesday afternoon changed everything. The All-Star Game was supposed to be a celebration. Baseball's midsummer showcase, scheduled for Seattle's T-Mobile Park, was building toward one of its most anticipated editions in years. Shohei Ohtani had been selected for the 6th consecutive time, and this year, the league had gone all in on making him the centerpiece of everything. The Home Run Derby. A 2-inning pitching appearance. 3 days of media obligations that would have had him in front of cameras from morning until midnight. He was the face of the event before the event had even begun. And alongside him, in what should have been one of the most joyful stories of the season, was Dalton rushing. The 23-year-old catcher had earned his first All-Star selection after a breakout first half that surprised even the most optimistic people inside the Dodgers organization. He had called his parents the moment he found out. His father cried. His mother screamed loud enough that Rushing had to pull the phone away from his ear. It was supposed to be the beginning of something beautiful for both of them. Instead, on a quiet afternoon, a press conference was called with less than 2 hours' notice. No context was given. No explanation was offered. Just a simple message sent to the media: Dave Roberts, Shohei Ohtani, and Dalton Rushing would be addressing reporters at 3 p.m. When the three of them walked into the room together, the energy shifted before a single word was spoken. Something was wrong. You could see it in the way Roberts positioned himself at the center microphone with the stiffness of someone carrying a heavy decision. You could see it in the way Ohtani sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set tight. You could see it in the way Rushing stared at the table in front of him, unable to bring himself to look directly into the cameras. And then Roberts leaned into the microphone and delivered the words that would dominate sports headlines for the next 72 hours. Shohei Ohtani and Dalton Rushing will not be participating in this year's All-Star Game. The room erupted immediately. Reporters shouted questions over one another. Camera shutters fired in rapid succession. But Roberts raised his hand slowly, and the noise fell away. He wasn't finished. He hadn't even started. He took a breath, steadied himself, and then began laying out the full story with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment for days. He explained that the decision had not been made lightly. He explained that it had come after extensive consultation with the team's medical staff, with the front office, and most importantly, with the players themselves. He was careful to emphasize that this was not about injury in the traditional sense. Neither player had come to the training staff with complaints. Neither had shown the kind of visible pain that typically triggers these conversations. This decision had come from somewhere else entirely. It had come from the tests. Over the previous 3 weeks, Roberts explained, both Ohtani and Rushing had undergone a series of comprehensive medical evaluations that went far beyond the standard protocols most organizations use. The testing wasn't prompted by performance concerns or visible physical issues. It was part of a broader initiative the Dodgers had quietly implemented earlier in the season, using advanced biomechanical tracking technology to monitor player health at a level that most teams in baseball simply don't have access to yet. The results, Roberts said slowly, were something they could not ignore. He reached for a folder on the table, opened it carefully, and began describing what the tests had revealed. For Ohtani, the findings centered on his throwing arm. Elevated inflammation markers. Shoulder fatigue that extended beyond normal wear and tear. And most alarmingly, stress patterns in the UCL, the ulnar collateral ligament, the same ligament that had already been surgically reconstructed earlier in his career. The doctors described what they were seeing as microtears at the cellular level. Not a full rupture. Not something that would show up on a standard MRI. But damage that accumulates quietly over time until one day it doesn't stay quiet anymore. For Dalton rushing, the picture was different but equally serious. Significant inflammation in both knees. Early signs of cartilage wear. Muscular compensation patterns that were increasing his injury risk with every game he caught. The doctors had run the numbers and found that his knee cartilage was wearing at a rate approximately 40% faster than what would be expected for a catcher his age. Roberts closed the folder and looked directly into the cameras. And then he explained what MLB had asked of these two players during All-Star Week, and why the answer was no. They had asked rushing to catch in the Futures game the day before the All-Star Game, then remain available as a backup catcher for the main event if needed. Roberts had shared the medical data with the league office 4 days before the press conference, hoping for a collaborative conversation about how to manage both players responsibly. What he received instead was a response that told him everything he needed to know about where the league's priorities truly stood. The league office had reviewed the findings and described the results as elevated but manageable. They suggested the Dodgers were being overly cautious. They reminded the organization of the contractual obligations players carry regarding All-Star participation. And that was when Dave Roberts decided he was done having a quiet conversation. His voice didn't rise when he talked about this. It didn't need to. There was something in the steady, controlled way he delivered his criticism that made it land harder than any outburst could have. He said clearly that he didn't care about contractual obligations when the health of his players was at stake. He said that if the league wanted to classify data showing UCL stress and accelerated cartilage degradation as manageable, then they were having a very different conversation about what that word means. And then he said the line that every reporter in that room would be quoting within the hour. He said that if MLB was going to push Shohei Ohtani that hard, knowing what the tests showed, then Ohtani simply would not play. Period. The room went so quiet after that sentence that you could hear the ventilation system running in the ceiling. Because everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't just a manager protecting his players. This was the Los Angeles Dodgers, one of the most powerful franchises in professional sports, drawing a line directly in front of the commissioner's office and daring anyone to cross it. Then Shohei Ohtani leaned toward his microphone, and the room went quieter still. He began speaking in Japanese, his translator Ippei Mizuhara positioned beside him and converting each word carefully into English. Ohtani said that he loved the All-Star Game. He said he loved playing in front of the fans, loved representing the Dodgers, loved everything that the Midsummer Classic was supposed to represent. But he also said that he knew his body, and that when the doctors had placed the test results in front of him and walked him through what they meant, he had understood immediately. He talked about 2018, about Tommy John surgery, about what it felt like to miss an entire year of baseball because his arm had been pushed past the point where it could protect itself. He said he remembered what it felt like when your body is telling you something is wrong and you choose not to listen because you don't want to disappoint people. He said he remembered how that choice felt afterward, sitting in a training room instead of a dugout for 12 months. And he said he wasn't willing to make that choice again. He acknowledged the uncertainty. He said maybe he could pitch in the All-Star Game and be perfectly fine. Maybe the home run derby would cause no additional stress. Maybe he was being overcautious and everything would turn out well. But then he said something that stopped every person in that room. He said maybe was not good enough. Not when they were trying to win a championship. Not when he had already been through the alternative once and knew exactly how dark that road was. Then he switched to English, speaking slowly and deliberately, his accent thick but his meaning unmistakably clear. He said he was sorry to the fans. Sorry to Seattle. But he had to think about October. He had to think about his team. And if he damaged his arm in July for an exhibition game, he said quietly, he would not be able to forgive himself. He sat back from the microphone when he finished, and the room remained still for a long moment before anyone thought to ask another question. When attention shifted to Dalton rushing, the emotional weight in the room became something almost tangible. This was his first All-Star selection. For most players, that moment represents the peak of a career's early chapter, proof that the work was worth it, confirmation that they belonged at this level. He should have been celebrating in Seattle in 2 weeks, not sitting at a press conference explaining why he wouldn't be there. His voice was quiet when he started speaking, and it cracked slightly on his first sentence before he steadied himself and pushed forward. He talked about calling his parents when he found out he'd made the team. He described his father crying and his mother screaming so loud he had to hold the phone away from his ear. He said it was the best moment of his life, and then he paused for long enough that the silence itself told you how much it hurt to follow that sentence with what came next. He said the medical staff had shown him the test results and explained what the inflammation in his knees meant, what the cartilage wear could become if it wasn't managed properly, and what catching in 2 games in 2 days during All-Star Week would likely do to a body already showing these warning signs. And he said that when he sat with all of that information, when he thought about the kind of career he wanted to have, he understood that this wasn't really a choice between the All-Star Game and nothing. It was a choice between the All-Star Game and everything that came after it. He said he was 23 years old. He said he wanted a 15-year career. He wanted to catch in World Series games. He wanted to be an All-Star 10 more times. And he knew, with a clarity that he said surprised him a little, that none of those things would happen if he broke his body down in July trying to do too much too soon. His voice was steady by the end. The disappointment was still visible in his face, but underneath it was something that looked like resolve. He trusted the people around him. And he was choosing the future over the moment. After both players left the room, Roberts remained to field additional questions, and that was when the final and perhaps most significant layer of the story was revealed. A reporter asked about the specific testing protocols the Dodgers had used, pressing for detail on how these results had been generated when standard medical evaluations had apparently shown nothing alarming. Roberts glanced briefly toward the team's medical staff seated at the back of the room and received a small, confirming nod before he continued. He explained that the Dodgers had been using advanced biomechanical tracking technology that operates at a level most organizations in baseball haven't yet adopted. It measures joint stress in real time, tracks muscle activation patterns, and detects inflammation markers at a cellular level that standard imaging and examination protocols simply cannot reach. He described it as going beyond what any routine team physical would reveal, designed specifically to catch the kind of slow-building damage that doesn't announce itself until it becomes catastrophic. He confirmed that the Dodgers had offered to share both the technology and the specific findings with the league office when they submitted their medical report 4 days earlier. The league's response had been that the testing methods weren't officially recognized by MLB's Medical Standards Committee and that the organization appeared to be drawing conclusions from experimental data. Roberts let that characterization sit in the air for a moment before responding. He said that what they had was test results showing clear, documented, measurable injury risk in 2 of their most important players. He said they had offered that information to the league in good faith. And he said the league had chosen to classify it as experimental and proceed with their participation requests anyway. He didn't editorialize beyond that. He didn't need to. The facts themselves were the editorial. Within an hour of the press conference ending, MLB had released a formal statement expressing disappointment in the Dodgers' decision and describing player participation in the All-Star Game as an essential part of growing the sport globally. The statement made no reference to the medical data. It contained no acknowledgement of the test results or the specific health concerns Roberts had outlined. It was careful, corporate language wrapped around a position the league was clearly not prepared to defend in public on medical terms. But across baseball, the conversation had already moved past the league's statement and into something larger. Other teams were making calls to the Dodgers' medical staff, asking about the biomechanical tracking technology. Representatives from the players' union were reaching out to their contacts inside the organization. Agents were beginning to ask publicly why these kinds of advanced diagnostics weren't a standard part of league-wide player health protocols. A single press conference had turned into a referendum on how baseball treats the bodies of the players it depends on. Dave Roberts sat in his office that evening as the coverage rolled across every sports network in the country. When a reporter who had stayed late asked if he had any regrets about how the day had unfolded, his answer came without hesitation and without decoration. He said that in October, when Shohei Ohtani was healthy and Dalton rushing was behind the plate in games that actually mattered, nobody would remember the All-Star Game they had missed. But if they had pushed those two players through All-Star Week against the evidence and one of them had gotten hurt, he said they would never forgive themselves. The All-Star Game would go on without them. The show would continue, as it always does. But something had changed in the way the sport was looking at itself, and that change had started in a press conference room at Dodger Stadium on a Tuesday afternoon. Some decisions are difficult precisely because they require choosing what is right over what is easy. And sometimes, protecting your players means being willing to stand in front of the entire league and say enough.